All right, everyone. I'll just perhaps wait just one more minute to let guests come in, and I'll introduce our webinar today. All right, perhaps we can get started. Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on Indigenous land struggles, transregional perspectives across Asia and Africa. So today's webinar is the first in what promises to be an exciting webinar series for those of you that are interested in land and social justice struggles that are occurring across Asia and Africa. And this series is being co-produced and hosted by the Interdisciplinary Global Development Center, also known as the IGDC, at the University of York in the United Kingdom, and the Center for Asia and Africa, or CASA, at the University of Pretoria, South Africa. My name is Saba Joshi. I'm the Deputy Director of the IGDC and a lecturer in the Department of Politics at the University of York. And I am co-chairing this event alongside Professor Alf Gunvald Nilsen, the Director of CASA and a Professor in Sociology at the University of Pretoria. So the IGDC is an interdisciplinary research community for equitable global development based at the University of York. Our center brings together researchers from across the humanities, social sciences, and natural sciences within the University of York and globally. And we encourage researchers to work with one another and with policymakers and practitioners to address global development challenges. The IGDC is very pleased to be partnering with the Center for Asia and Africa at the University of Pretoria to produce this webinar series. The Center for Asian Studies in Africa, or CASA for short, is a newly established hub for research in the field of Asian studies and studies of historical and contemporary Afro-Asian connections. So before I introduce our panel for today, I'd like to mention a couple of housekeeping points. So this session is being recorded, but only the video and audio of the panelists are being recorded. Attendees' mics are muted and your video is off, and so you won't be recorded. The only information that may be recorded are any questions that you type in, and that may include your name, which could be identified based on your Zoom name. Following the presentation by the panelists, which will be around 15 minutes each, we will have around 30 minutes for question and answers, and this part of the webinar will be led by my co-chair, Alf Gunvald Nilsen. To ask any questions, please click on the Q&A button in the bottom bar. The panelists will answer questions submitted through the Q&A function. So questions can also be voted on. So if someone has asked a question that is interesting or asked a question that you were interested in, specifically give it a vote, and those with the most votes will be answered first. For those of you that use Twitter, you can find us and follow us at York_IGDC, and please feel free to tweet about this webinar using the hashtag CASA IGDC webinar. You can also follow CASA on Twitter at CAsian SA Africa UP. So, and if you're having any technical issues, please use the chat function to talk to the IGDC webinar host. So all the questions go into the Q&A button and the tech issues in the chat, please. So without further ado, I'll just introduce our wonderful panel here today, and I'll introduce them in the order that they will be speaking. So first, we have Lway Mownt Noon, a human rights and gender activist from Myanmar. Her work focuses on identity rights, civil and political rights. Noon is an ethnic Tang woman, a member of a small minority hill tribe and indigenous group in the diverse ethnic context of Myanmar. She is a former political prisoner for over 6 years between 1996 and 2002 because of her active participation in anti-dictatorship and pro-democracy movements in Myanmar. She fled the country following the military crackdown in 2022. And she's currently a research fellow at the Center for Applied Human Rights at the University of York, and she continues her activism work. Welcome, Noon. Second, we have Aashish Xaxa, an assistant professor of sociology, tribal and development studies in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Indian Institute for Technology in Gandhinagar, India. He obtained his PhD in development studies from the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, TIS, in Mumbai. And his PhD examined the development of tribes, indigenous people of central and northeast India, with special reference to urbanization, constitutional and legal provisions, development, land tenure systems, and local government. Aashish's articles have been published and are forthcoming in international peer-reviewed journals, including Economic and Political Weekly and Social Change, and several edited books and volumes, including the United Nations Encyclopedia of Sustainable Development. Thirdly, we have Mbuso Nkosi, is a lecturer in sociology at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. His research is focused on labor studies, industrial policy, political economy, agrarian studies, archives, and social theory. He has served as an editor for Global Labour Column, GLC, and the South African Labour Bulletin. His recent book, titled These Potatoes Look Like Humans, The Contested Future of Land, Home, and Death in South Africa, was published by Wits University Press in 2023. Additionally, he has co-edited the PhD Experience in African Higher Education, published by Lexington Press, and Struggle in a Time of Crisis, published by Pluto Press. Welcome to all our panelists, and I will pass on the floor now to our first speaker today, Noon. Please, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Zabat. And the Rose or everybody, Rose or means that like as the greeting in the Ang language that the Ang, as Zabat introduced about the Ang and me, about me. So I'm the Ang ethnic. The Ang ethnic is one of an indigenous group of Hmong Khmer descent in Myanmar. So we the Ang are struggling in Myanmar for our rights and for our land and for our, how to say, future. So anyhow, today, so I like to press, although I am the Ang ethnic, one of the minorities within the minorities in Myanmar, anyhow, so I like to present today at the side of the indigenous or indigenous in Myanmar. So that's why that place I like to continue my presentation. That our main source of income came from working from the tea leaf plantation and producing of the final tea product for consumers in Myanmar and China. So anyhow, for our land, for our, how to say, for our future, for our nature, so we are struggling. So not only the Ang, but also the other ethnic, over 135 ethnic groups and indigenous people in Myanmar. So Myanmar, formerly known as Burma, is home to 54 million people, including more than 135 ethnic groups and indigenous people. Myanmar is thus considered to be one of the most ethnically diverse countries in Southeast Asia. The former government of Myanmar grouped the country's diverse population into 8 national races: Burma, Chin, Kachin, Kaya, Mon, Rakhine, and Shan. Of these 8, Burma, also known as Burmese or Burman, represent the majority of the population and dominate the country politics and economy. Since many indigenous people do not see themselves as belong to any of the official recognized 8 races, this classification was seen as government imposed and not recognized by many in Myanmar indigenous activist community. Many Myanmar voted in favor of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, in 2007. However, as of yet, the government has failed to develop a national action plan and incorporate it into its legal system. Myanmar did not ratify ILO Convention 169 yet. 2000 Constitution, Myanmar Constitution, constitutionally, the land and natural resources in Myanmar belongs to the state. Neither the customary land ownership nor the customary land management systems are recognized legally or respected only. Regarding with the historical injustice towards indigenous people in Myanmar, Myanmar gained its independence from Great Britain in 1948. with crucial support from the indigenous peoples. However, soon after independence, it became clear that politicians representing the ethnic majority were not inclined to respect the provisions of the Bandung Agreement and the promises given to the indigenous people. As a result, the country has descended into a civil war that, with various degree or intensities, continues to this day. The 1962 military coup, which was the first military coup in Myanmar, has marked the beginning of a half-century-long military rule that was accompanied by the forced Burmanization, assimilation of the country's many indigenous peoples through so-called one religion, one culture, one language, and one identity policy. In 2012, the parliament, controlled by the pro-military USDP, Union Solidarity and Development Party, rapidly passed a series of new laws intended to facilitate foreign investment. Yes. These laws included the vacant, fallow and virgin lands management law, VFV law, farmland laws, investment laws, and forest law. These laws made indigenous lands ownerless and became a legitimate tool for land grabbing. During the era of the military government, Myanmar's authority practically didn't need any justification to deprive entire communities of their land. With the introduction of these laws, such a practice has been effectively written into law. The VFV law was amended in 2016 after the civilian government, National League for Democracy, and led by Aung San Suu Kyi, came to power. However, this amendment didn't improve the situation of indigenous land users. Not only did the new version again fail to recognize indigenous land ownership system, but it also kept the provisions that were used to criminalize indigenous peoples unchanged. In some areas, indigenous community members are uniting and successfully protesting activities on their land. At some point, there were around 24 active armed ethnic opposition groups fighting. We call ethnic armed organizations fighting the military government force in Myanmar for their self-determination, including the ethnic also. In response, the military instated the true supremacy of terror in the country's frontiers area through its infamous focused counter-insurgency tactics. This fell especially heavy on indigenous peoples. The civilian population residing in conflict-affected area was subjected to massive displacement, forced labor, and violence, including sexual violence, torture, and imprisonment. It was until the first years of the new millennium that the military government started to engage in ceasefire negotiation with some of the ethnic armed groups in 2014-2015. The tension between the civil and military branches of the government were very visible between 2015 and 2020. The militarization of many areas inhabited by indigenous people continues to this day. In some part of the country, violence, confrontations between ethnic armed groups and the government force still occur on a regular basis. When indigenous land rights defenders try to protest invasion using formal mechanisms, we were faced with heavy bureaucracy and corrupt land restitution mechanisms that involved various government agencies, mistrust towards government agency as a result of many years of oppression, ongoing discrimination towards indigenous peoples, including using only the Burmese language in official proceedings, as well as a lack of resource to pay the necessary fees and bribes, makes indigenous people especially vulnerable when dealing with government agencies whose support role is to protect the citizens' rights. Our indigenous people effort for our self-determination as indigenous people in Myanmar continues our effort to strengthen indigenous customary governance system through the customary land use documentation and mapping. It will be crucial for people in Myanmar to recognize the indigenous people rights to land, territory, and natural resources in the upcoming national law, which was the drafting process in 2020. Yes. The political transition and the reforms of the past decades in Myanmar had been carried out without addressing root cause of discrimination against indigenous peoples, continued omnipresence of military in all aspects of life in the country and widespread corruption. Lack of justice and trust deficit pose additional challenges to achieving any change in Myanmar. So thus, it is important to ensure transparency and active citizen participation in the process of designing the policies and laws for a new democratic Myanmar to prevent the victimization of people in the course of the reform. Many indigenous people in Myanmar have been displaced from their land due to discriminatory policy and armed conflicts, and the deadly airstrikes staged by the military-led State Administration Council (SAC) that carried out the February 2021 coup that ousted the country's civilian government from power, affected tens of thousands of villagers, including thousands of refugees already seeking safety in nearby internally displaced people, IDP camps close to the border with Thailand, India, and China. They are regularly cut off from the resource and the traditions that are vital to their identity, well-being, and survival. The current situation, civil war in Myanmar, forced them to flee their homes and land and to IDP camps and to the jungle and to the border area, or face greater marginalization, poverty, disease, violence, and even extinction as an indigenous people. That's why that I, on behalf of all indigenous people, we assume that there is needed a digital magazine or platform which aim to address the struggles, achievements, and issues of the indigenous people in a perspective from within the territories and the communities themselves, with the academic knowledge and activist engagement, which the vision is to become a communications medium of reference for indigenous people, as well as an instrument that contributes to the defense of human rights and nature. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thanks very much, Noon. That was extremely interesting. We'll move on to our next speaker, Aashish Xaxa from IIT Gandhinagar will be presenting next.
Thank you, Saba. And thank you to IGDC and and to Alf at the University of Pretoria. I'll be sharing the screen. I'll just hope that you'll be able to. Is this visible?
Yes, it's visible, Aashish.
Okay, great. So, so the paper that I want to present here is drawing from the issue that we are discussing today on land struggles. I'll be sharing my paper, Dismantling Colonial Cartography in Indigenous Urbanism as Speciality in India. Now, if we look at land in the case of India, especially in the indigenous slash tribal land, they have been historically earmarked as the fifth and within the fifth and the sixth scheduled areas of the Indian Constitution, which further have a larger historical precedence, which came in the excluded areas, which was the northeast region, and the partially excluded areas, which was part of central India, some parts of western, some parts of northern India. Now, what this did was that it, in a way, took away the land ownership, or it, in a way, brought in land ownership pattern within colonial administration. And what I'm trying to argue in this paper is that can we think of, giving back land ownership, the idea of ownership back to the tribal communities. So what I plan to do in this article, what I've done is that I have examined the politics of cartographic imaginaries as a necessarily incomplete project which has been carried forward by the post-colonial state. And this has transpired in various usages by the state, including acquisition of tribal land for the purpose of extractive industries and other forms of development. And I trace this back to the Great Trigonometric Survey, which I call as a civilizational project, which was used to, which was used for the purpose of several developmental projects. And this phenomena, this practice, this particular extractive philosophy has continued in the post-colonial state, which has left more Adivasis in a landlocked land grid than as emancipatory communities. Furthermore, if you see, there have been new judicial categories such as encroachers or illegal occupants, which have been created by the Forest Department as well as by the legal heads, despite the fact that they have been living in forests centuries before the annexation of their territory by the colonial state. So what I did was that I draw from my own field experiences among the Oraos and the Mundas tribes in Jharkhand and the Khasi tribes in Meghalaya. So what I'm highlighting here is that in inhabiting the land, there are specific relations that are there is a symbiotic relationship between the indigenous peoples and their territory, which the state does not necessarily have a clue of. Tribes traditionally classify land for usages similar to the use of cartography, such as wetlands, sand, forest, trees, and so on and so forth. In addition to it, they have also developed specific spiritual relationships with that land. They have been built around customs, traditions, myths, values that have sustained land for over several generations. There is an intimate relationship between land and tribe, and this is critical to keep in mind because this, in a way, informs the epistemology, land and life world, which are also the sources of collective memories and have come to define much of the relationship with what tribes have with their land. And in drawing from this historical argument, which I'll also be explaining further. I argue that it is imperative that land control be returned to the indigenous communities who have a more holistic understanding of it, rather than keeping it in the vestiges of the state. Now, if we see how has cartography been framed, I take this example from a recent conflict between the police forces of two northeastern states, Assam and Mizoram, which took place on 26 July 2021. This has brought out one of the many such border altercations in the northeast. Northeast has been in the news recently due to the violence in Manipur. The way I analyze it is because there has been a sustained history of border conflict, especially with Assam and several other parts of the northeast. Most of these states were tribal states, which were part of the Assam province, created in 1912 by the British after the partition of the Bengal, and then the subsequent split of the Bengal province. A lot of these tribal districts began their autonomous movements and subsequently broke away from from Assam, due to which there is still a feeling of territorial loss in Assam, due to which such skirmishes often take place. I call this as a form of neo-colonialism, which has broadly cast linguistic contours. This also brings into question the notion of a homogeneous northeast when viewed from outside, especially when we have to view the idea of a northeast. We think most observers tend to look at it as a homogeneous entity. But when we actually go to the region, we see that it is extremely diverse. So I argue that there can never be a unified, homogeneous northeast within the region, given which such diversity among the tribal communities, each having their own distinct histories, languages, cultures, epistemologies, ethnic sense, as well as political aspirations. And in this context, it is even more important to understand the idea of cartography and what implications does it have for the case of the Adivasis. So, if we go back right in history, we can see that. Sorry. There's some technical glitch, I think. Okay, so if we go back to the history of cartography, we can see that it was first framed by Captain James Cook, who was known for discovering several sea routes all the way to New Zealand and Australia. This is a map of his Pacific voyages, and the one on the right shows his death in I believe it was in the Fiji Islands. In 1779. Now, what did he actually frame? Now, this is just a sort of a brief intro into cartography. The word cartography has been taken from the word charts, which means a map. The idea behind cartography is that reality, be it real or an imagined reality, can be modeled in a way that communicates spatiality, and it has been traced back to Babylon, Greeks, the Romans. Most of these civilizations were extending their borders from about 1550 BC onwards. Modern colonialism began after the Renaissance period, which is also known as the age of discovery, as people from Europe began to move outside the European landmass into other territorial spaces. In 1584, writer Richard Hakluyt presented Queen Elizabeth I with a program, and this plan was derived out of a study of both Portuguese and Spanish colonial models, which was simultaneously designed to satisfy all of England's imported wants, as well as rendering it independent of the foreign suppliers. And this is how, in a way, Britain sort of embarks upon its colonial expeditions. It is through these colonial expeditions that cartography becomes extremely important as a tool, which comes sharply into focus, into actually seeing how actually colonialism took place. So, in the case of Bengal, in the case of India, we can see that some of the earlier surveys were done in 1767. The first recorded scientific survey can be traced back to 1793. As the British gained increasing foothold in the subcontinent, these earlier surveys were dwarfed by what came to be known as the Great Trigonometric Survey, initiated by the British infantry officer William Lambton. This survey was carried out, it reached its zenith under the aegis of Sir George Everest, after whom Mount Everest has been named. So this project aimed to introduce a modern scientific survey technique, not only to create a spatial image of India, but also to legitimize the colonial activities and the triumphs of science, which brought civilization to an irrational land. Now, if we make an argument for this, the irrationality as seen from the eyes of the Western colonial thinkers can be seen as that of the caste system, which is followed by the descendant of the Aryan people in India. Max Weber, in a study of Asiatic religions, believed that most of them are so irrational that that industrial capitalism, which is promoted from the practice of Protestant ethics, cannot be followed in India. Yet, despite having a numerically high caste population, India also has a substantive tribal population, and these are the communities whom I am actually focused upon. This is why the idea of cartography, which frames land as a universal idea, is unsuitable in the context of indigenous peoples who have a deep and almost spiritual connection with the land. So these are two maps which I was able to see. This was Jharkhand in central India under the Mughal Empire in the 16th century. On the right hand is Jharkhand, as was demanded by Adivasi leader Jaipal Singh from his party, the Jharkhand Party, towards the end of the British rule. So you can see that the state is not just the current state of Jharkhand, but it also has areas of Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh, parts of Bengal, parts of Odisha. So it's a large, parts of Bihar. So it's a large, Adivasi territorial state. So what, again, to give a quick history primer, Samar Basu Malik has written that when the Oraons of Nagpur settled in this area, they had a vast sense of territoriality. For them, the land was a continuous topography where they roamed and settled. Thereby, in their vocabulary, there was no such word as country. It was the British East India Company that began the colonization of Jharkhand, and with the entry of the British, large-scale transfer of tribal land began to happen from tribes to non-tribes in a legal manner through the Sale, Law and Rent Act of 1859. If we come to Northeast, this is a portrait of Shillong, the capital of Meghalaya. This is the entrance of Shillong around late 19th century, and this is a map of the Khasi independent estates in Meghalaya. So similarly to Jharkhand, when the British arrived in the East Khasi Hills, there were three different types of land tenure systems, which till date have remained untouched. You know, the land which came, so it was primarily Reride, Rikpur, and Likinti, which was, clan land, community land, and private land. So what I'm trying to highlight from these two examples is a lack of colonial cartographic exercise, which was already existing in the pre-empire and the pre-state formation, which gave a massive degree of autonomy to the indigenous people of their region, who had their own indigenous cartographic arrangements. So what happens post 1947, once India achieves independence? There is massive usurpation of tribal land, which takes place in Ranchi via death, forcible capture, and other unethical means. So in Shillong, however, such acquisition did not occur, due to the region not being a very industrially feasible region. But villages surrounding the city were gradually transformed into suburbs, providing those working in government and non-government offices with the housing facilities. But this also paved the way for the growth of trade and commerce in the area, with the establishment of educational and health institutions. This has led to massive congestion in both these townships, where roads, civic amenities, and housing has multiplied, not only in the areas within the municipality but also in the areas in the surrounding villages. So what I argue is that this is a continuation of the colonial cartographic practices of usurping land through state control. Both land holding patterns in the pre-colonial period have shown a remarkable clarity in the way land was organized around these communities, which was also informing the social customs, practices, and worldviews of the tribes. And with the land holding system, the tribes were also imbued with a sense of autonomy through the idea of self determination in their cultures, customs, tradition, and worldviews. So what I argue is that development has, in a way, disrupted this sort of symbiotic relationship which these communities had for a long time. And what I argue with this paper is that I sort of harken back to the Brundtland Commission of 1983, which said that the future will be predominantly urban, and most people's concerns will be that of the environmental nature, with specific reference to urban spaces. So here, what I'm trying to argue is that if we talk about land, we need to understand that tribal people recognize nature and its resources, nurture and support generations, and also their intergenerational growth, which allows it to reach its full potential while also harnessing natural resources for regeneration and for growth. It is for this reason that tribes have looked upon nature with a sense of reverence. And I feel that these ideas are, in a way, in sync with what the Brundtland Commission's definition of sustainable development has been trying to articulate. So how can we move, this is towards the end of my presentation, how can we move towards the idea of a indigenous urban space? What has happened in India, I argue, that it's just a blanket continuation of the colonial practices through the post-colonial in the post-colonial era. I also invoke here, I've not mentioned it, but I also invoke the ideas of Andre Gundo Frank, who has invoked the idea of the dependency theory, and that dependency is brought out some massive extractive practices in tribal regions in India, which has led to several thousands and millions of tribes being displaced in the name of development. But what recent events have highlighted, especially COVID-19, was that a lot of these economic projects collapsed, which exposed the hollow roots of the neoliberal economy. So, circling back to my earlier argument, I argue that the Great Trigonometric Surveys project had left more indigenous people in a land grid than emancipated. And in this article, I have tried to highlight that people have had a sort of reverential relationship with land, and it is important to keep in mind that in tribal epistemology, land and life worlds are not just just realities, but they are also the sources of collective memory, because predominantly tribal societies are oral societies, not written societies. So they have a very different notion of land than what has been propagated through the colonial times. The core of land relations which exist in indigenous communities comes from a very spiritual perspective that does not necessarily stress on individual and private property, as Max Weber has sort of elucidated in his work on urban spaces. So there is a clear contradiction between what indigenous communities believe and what the colonial state has believed. Now, although we have to be careful, because here it is not a uniform notion of land ownership. There have been some fissures of clan, gender, class, but broadly the notion of collective participation and ownership does remain with the community. And this stands in stark contrast to the idea of the individual notion, which is deeply rooted in the liberal capitalist idea. And to conclude, I argue that if this highly organized system of landholding and land management can be brought into urban spaces, it will make a significant difference in the way cities and future spaces are actually designed and planned. This will introduce a sort of new way of looking at urban development, which has not been seen before. And I argue that this is something that should be really sort of stressed upon. And in this sense, we have to, in a way, give back land control back to the community rather than keeping it in the vestige of the state. So with that, I end my presentation here, and thanks a lot for listening. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Aashish, for that very detailed and informative presentation. So I will pass the floor now to Mbuso to speak about his recent research. Thank you.
Thanks. And thanks to the IGDC and CASA for allowing us to have this round table. To colleagues, Noon, Aashish, I've noted some of the interesting points that you have made, and I think we will find some connections with what I'll be presenting. And for me, I've shared a quote already in the chat box. This is a very interesting quote that comes from Solomon Plaatje. He writes about the 1913 Land Act. And in writing about this 1913 Land Act, he documents how he had uncovered families who were dispossessed, who were labor tenants moving from a region in South Africa known as the Free State, trying to find a space where they are going to share crop. And in this, he writes that Miss Hobadi carried a sick baby when the eviction took place. 2 days out the line, one began to sink, the little one began to sink as the result of privation and exposure on the road. Its little soul was released from its earthly bonds. They, the Hobadi family, had no right or title to the farmlands through which they tread. They must keep to the public roads, the only place in the country open to the outcast in which the dispossessed are permitted to travel. The deceased child had to be buried, but where, when, and how? This young wandering family decided to dig a grave under the cover of the darkness of that night, when no one was looking, and in that crude manner, the dead child was interred, and interred amid fear and trembling, as well as the throbs of a torturing anguish in a stolen grave lest the proprietor of the spot or any of his servants should surprise them in the act. And in this act of stealing a grave, Sol Plaatje writes that many of the South Africans woke up to discover themselves as pariahs in the land that they were born in. So let's keep that in mind because I want to return to it a bit later on. So in my focus today, I think I'll draw a bit on my two concepts from my book, These Potatoes Look Like Humans, the concept of ontological knownness and the concept of eschatological future, which I will expand later on. So I want to first focus on how land reform has been studied in South Africa and give voice in how land reform has been studied, and then move to how this method of studying land reform has also come to influence the struggle for land in South Africa. And you would realize that I think the challenge for me is that in the South African landscape, it is, the concept of the indigenous when it comes to land reform is one that is not well discussed. Instead, it is the concept of the people that drives the discussion. And you would see that the people is also a contested concept in South Africa because others only refer to the collective subject of Black people when they speak of the people as those who are dispossessed. But others refer to a long tradition of non-racialism in South Africa that goes beyond race when it refers to a people. But I think the concept of indigenous knowledge, when we think of it critically, I'm a bit skeptical here, Aashish. Maybe we can have a discussion about the question of tribe, because it carries even the Euro-modern expression. Maybe we should be thinking of society as a sociological category. But I think the idea of indigenous knowledge system opens up, ways in which the political concept of the people, which is grounded in the Euro-modern concept of the nation state, fails to express. So that's just my few notes before I kick in about my observation around land reform. So I would say land reform has been studied in 5 ways in South Africa. One is the treatment of land, which colleagues have also mentioned, as a factor of production, looking at land in a materialistic way, livelihoods, economic development, its contribution to the economy. And then the second point is that of the period of transition, where we look at the period of transition from, apartheid to 1994, where a new government comes in, where the argument is that the period of transition sees an elite capture of land reform, and which this elite capture betrays, the need for redress and justice. And then the third one is that, these are much more technical debates about economies of scale and the scale of land, and the question then becomes, if you go for land reform, are we going to speak of small scale and looking at South Africa with its, a tendency of having large scale hectares of land? Are we going to continue with this method? So that's also another debate then. Another one that I think that is now gaining traction or is seen as a possible solution is that of the question of the law. Where the issue of land reform is said to be one that reflects the failure of the Constitution to deal with the injustices of the past. The current Constitution is said to be a Constitution, that is written by the settler, by those who are critical of it. But others see within the Constitution in South Africa a possibility of a radical reform, especially, around private property, that we can go beyond private property and discuss what is said, to be expropriation without compensation as a method of addressing the injustices of the past. So while noting these, I'm arguing that in these debates, there's a less reflection on what I call an eschatological future. this eschatological future is in relation to the way in which land is linked to spirituality, linked to the ethical and ideas of the cosmos, death, birth, preservation of land as a collective act of collective preservation. And in this, that's why I quote this quote by Solomon Plaatje, because he shows us that when people are also dispossessed, they are also removed from their sense of being, which is also the grave, you know, our ability to be returned to the grave. So then the struggles, so then I'm shifting to the second part in South Africa to look at the struggles for land and what is it that they reflect. The struggles for land then reflect, similar to what the colleagues have said, an articulation of ways of being with the ancestral lands to govern the land, sometimes according to traditional laws and customs. But this is really contested because the South African social order has a bifurcated law, one which is a liberal constitution and one that also within this Bill of Rights protects, you know, the tradition and customs. So in some areas, the debate is about the insecurity of land tenure of those who are living in traditionally governed lands. And the debate is still going on, especially with in KwaZulu-Natal with the Ingonyama Trust, where there are other proposals about the provision of title deeds, you know, in such lands as a way of providing security, some form of return to private property, which Noon, you have, Noon and Aashish have also come to critique. So this struggle essentially goes to the crux of the problem of where is a home for those who are dispossessed, a struggle for a home. So, and how can their ways of being shape the relationship with the land, which creates structures that go beyond the current law? And I think this is where other case studies help us see, you know, ways and proposals. And I've been reading a bit about the CAHR, for example, in Canada and their relationship, their contracts with mining companies, how they've been building a system based on reciprocity, based on their cosmos, you know. So for many communities, then land is not just a material space, but a living entity that holds cultural, spiritual, and historical significance. So the loss of land often means the erosion of cultural identity. And hence land struggle are also seen as a way of preserving, you know, this life and relationship with the cosmos. And for example, we see in cases where mining companies in Limpopo, KwaZulu-Natal, and Mpumalanga dispossess people of their graves. And this struggle is indicative of the fact that the dispossessed have been moved, as I say, you know, from their ways of being the cosmos. And the process of proletarianization then were intended to separate them from a cycle of life-making processes where they are beings or they become beings of nowhere. And this is what I call ontological nowhereness. And I think this ontological nowhereness is best expressed in that quote that I've shared when it comes to the struggle that Sol Plaatje explains. So through a protection of a collective way of life, then we realize that the struggle for land today is one that goes beyond anthropocentrism of development and its extractive nature, which is centered on an exological understanding of being with the land that only sees it in economic terms. And so this is what we see, for example, in the struggles in the Eastern Cape in Kolobeni, where the titanium mining company Transworld and Transworld Energy and Mineral Resources has been proposing a top-down method that seeks to conceal information about the land from the community, pushing a narrative of economic development, jobs, and prosperity. But this has also meant that community activists who are opposing this kind of development have had to be assassinated in brutal ways, you know, and many families have been broken. But it's not just the breaking of families, it's also a destruction of knowledge when activists are being killed, you know. So since then, I quote one of the writings from the Center of Applied Legal Studies here at WITS that says that since then, the community has been able to fight this and has been able to access versions of these documents from the mining companies, and has used these to support a strong objection to mining in this region. In fact, in 2018, the Constitutional Court upheld the community's right to say no to mining and to decide their own developmental path. At the same time, the community pressed forward with an application believing that all communities in South Africa also deserve an opportunity to freely access information about operations that impact them in order for them to make informed decisions about mining in their area. But this was opposed by the mining company, Transworld Energy and Mineral Resources. I thought I was going to be able to conclude with something else. I see that I only have 2 minutes. So unfortunately, I would not be able to conclude with that as an indication, of the fact that when we are dealing with these cases, we are also dealing with a case of, the present being haunted by issues of the past. And this is why then dispossession is constantly discussed in the public domain. So in my own studies, I have also been showing a raging conflict in agriculture, which I argue reflects the anxiety of the settler and their relationship with the land, where the labor tenants and farm workers are seen as a threat and they are being pushed out of the land or being killed. This violence, for me, does not reflect the superiority of the mining companies or the settlers, but it reflects their own omni-historical anxiety that wherever they go in the world, they would be met by people who are resisting and articulating ways of beings that seek to protect not just themselves, but a relationship of coexistence with the land. And this is a call for a creation of a home for all the living species and the dead. And this is what I call an eschatological future that reflects and rejects, I would say, this ontological knownness. And just to add, Aashish, maybe we can call it cartographies of knownness, So thank you.
All right, I'll just jump in there and thank all our 3 speakers for very interesting presentations. We've heard from Noon about indigenous land struggles under military dictatorship. We've heard from Aashish about land struggles in what I would say used to be the world's largest democracy, undergoing a rapid process of democratic decline with deep historical roots. And again, from Mbuso about similarly deeply rooted, historically entrenched questions around land, around spatiality, and around ways of imagining territory that links to ideas of indigeneity. And I think what we've sort of seen between these 3 talks is some of the fruitfulness of pursuing trans-regional dialogues between Asian and African contexts when we try and grapple with these very complex matters. I do have one overarching comment, and then I see there are a couple of questions in the Q&A box. Can I just encourage people to pop more questions into the Q&A, and I'll read them out from there to our respective speakers. I just wanted to make one comment, though, which I thought I could ask all 3 of you to comment on, and perhaps also comment on in light of what you've just heard each other say, which is that it strikes me that that spatial imaginaries and spatial historiographies, in a sense, are so integral to what we're talking about, to indigenous land struggles. And I'm wondering if when we talk about indigenous land struggles, whether it wouldn't be possible to think of this form of collective action as struggles to vindicate a way of imagining space and a way of imagining belonging and a way of imagining life worlds that militate against the logic of nation-state territoriality. That's not entirely unproblematic, or it's not entirely straightforward, I think, because in several of the contexts here, so I'm basically an India scholar who works in South Africa, and I'm struck by how in both India and South Africa there are risks entailed in thinking along these lines, because the notion of indigeneity also has a potential to lend itself to reactionary appropriation. Now, just two examples of that is the way in which belongingness in the South African context, for example, lends itself to xenophobic appropriations, where notions of belonging and arguably of being indigenous, or being the rightful inhabitants of the land that is our country, actually builds a sort of ferocious attachment to colonial borders. In the Indian context, which I also know fairly well, and specifically the Northeast Indian context that Aashish referred to, there's of course the way in which Hindu nationalism appropriates this concept of being indigenous and uses it to victimize some of the most marginal people in that particular region of India. And so there's something here about ideas of autochthony, of being of the who is the original and therefore the rightful inhabitant that we must think very carefully about. So I just wanted to put that to all three of you. And then there are some specific questions here. I thought I could read those out as well, and then we'll let the speakers back in if that's okay. So the first question is for Noon, from Ashley, who says, very interesting. Can you talk about what type of international engagement is or has been useful or not in the context of Myanmar? What support is most needed in Tang State? Then we have a question from Shimreza to Aashish, who asked, can you also shed some light on the approaches on how oral knowledge can be transmuted or extrapolated to align with the codification, legitimation of rights on land? Some European schools seem to point to cognitive semiotics as an important point to start for understanding indigenous territoriality, because there is no written text to ascertain their rights vis-a-vis the modern forms of legitimacy epitomized in the nation-state constitution. Question from Scott for Mbuso. I love the eschatological vision of your work. What is your thinking on how competing claims of indigeneity, autochthony, and nationhood are being advanced in and by Khoisan resurgence discourses? And with that, we have put an awful lot on our presenters' plates, and we should be fair to you guys and hand back over to you before it spills over. So maybe we should start with Noon and then work our way through the speakers as you presented, Noon, Aashish, and Mbuso, if that's all right.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ashley Scott. Thanks for your question, focusing on the, how to say, practically and the critical question. Yes, before I answer your question, that I like to how to say, share about the current Myanmar situation and before the military coup. Before the military coup 2021, we activists, political activists, environmental activists, and all of the civil society leaders, we were focusing to protect and defend for the nature, for our lives, and for our people. So after the military coup, the current ruling military dictatorship led by Mbuso Nkosi, they killed lots of activists, lots of protest, the people who protest to the military junta, and they killed lots of civil society leaders, and also most of the activists were imprisoned in the prison, and also we flee from Myanmar, and that we are exiled in Thai-Myanmar border area especially. So we we democracy activists, we never flee into China area. That's our that's our decision. So before the military coup, the third time military coup in 2021, we tried we were trying to to protect and defend our nature and our future. So after the military coup, because of their mass killing, because of the junta mass killing and the imprisonment, so we couldn't couldn't, actively defend and protect our environment and our nature and our people and our land. So impersonally, even me, now I'm exiled in the UK. Before I got to the UK, I was exiled in border area. So I was hiding in a place in the Thai Myanmar border area because of the even Thai police, because of the I had no my passport and legal documents were confiscated by the hunter. So that's why that I was, when I was exiled in Thailand, Thai Myanmar border area, so I was hiding. So most of our activists and civil society leaders were hiding at the border area. So that's why your question is very difficult, current situation. So that's why that I'd like to answer your question that the role of we need to brainstorm currently role of the international community and international government, how they can support to Myanmar, the current situation. So now we opposition groups to the junta, we are trying to end the military dictatorship in Myanmar, and then we can try to protect our people and our land and our our nature. So that's why that now honestly we civil society leaders and the civil society and all of the Myanmar people, including Burmese people, we try to to end the dictatorship fast. So so the civil war is high tension in Myanmar. So that's why that this is very difficult to answer your question directly. Anyhow, and also as the activist side and the indigenous people side, we would like to we would like to ask to the international community and international government, especially international government. So how they forgot to help the opposition and the oppositions to end who protest and to end the dictatorship. So international community forgot to help us. So that's why that we like to call to help the opposition more than you told and you produced the statement. So thank you so much. I'm the ethnic. So you mentioned in your you mentioned in your questions that for your we asked the end currently since February 2000 this year. So the National Liberation Army so capture seize the 7 towns, and the National Liberation Army and the civilian institutions are implementing the local governance in our area, and also as well as the so other ethnic people, other indigenous people are also trying to grab our land from the hunters, from the hands of hunters. So that's why that we are trying. We like to call to the international community and international governments to help to the opposition. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you very much. I'll hand over to Aashish.
Okay, thank you, Alf. So I'll make a quick dash of it because I have to rush for a class as well in 10 minutes. So to Q&A box by Shimresa. I think the question focuses on the codification of indigenous law. So I am not in favor of codifying the indigenous law, because from what my field experience has taught me, is that the minute you codify the indigenous law, the essence of the law transfers in a way from the community to the hands of the state, because it becomes a part of the legal system. So in that sense, the community in and of itself does not have any control on that customary law. So even if they would want to, say, modify or improve certain aspects of the law, that won't be possible, because it becomes because I had a discussion with a Adivasi legal scholar in Jharkhand, and he was saying that his take was also similar. He was saying that it will end up like becoming a Hindu marriage law or the Shariat law among Islam. The idea is that certain customary practices which have been taken from the community given to the state, and it becomes part of the legal jurisprudence, which then in a way legalizes the state's action upon the community, taking that customary law into account. So in that sense, I would say that there is a real need for, I think, reflections within the community. Similar reflections had taken place among the Nagas, I would say, a couple of years ago, where women were allowed to be part of the decision-making process. So I believe that when such dialogues take place within the community, there is a real progress that can be observed, as opposed to just giving it at the hands of the state. To Alf's comment about how can we counter the reactionary interpretation of the term indigenous? Yes, it is a serious concern in India. At least I would say it's very much part of Central India and southern western India. This is a long struggle, I would argue, because it goes back, if we take the sociological debate, it goes back to the debates of G.S. Ghurye, who had termed the Adivasis as backward Hindus, saying that they belong in the lineage, they belong to the lowest section of the Hindu fold, even lower than the Dalits. And in a way, the right-wing discourse has not moved past that. It has still stuck to that, and it has assumed a much more brutal interpretation of that particular theory. What we can do is that I think we need to certainly have discourses like the one we are having now, so that these ideas can come up on a platform and it can be discussed, deliberated, be it on a domestic level within the community, within the total national or such the international platform. I think the more discussions we have on these issues, I think it will churn out a greater resistance to such reactionary terms. So yeah, and just one final comment. I agree with what Mbuso has spoken about the elites in Africa. In a way, this is something I also teach in my development studies course, especially the works of Walter Rodney, who also spoke about the idea of the elite capture in Africa, due to which dependency had been really magnified in the continent. So I completely agree with what he said. I think we can have a longer discussion after the talk, and I'll be happy to share more thoughts on that. Yeah, thanks a lot.
All right, and Mbuso, over to you.
Thanks for the question, and I think the question that was posed to me is similar to the question that you're also posing, Alf. So when we are thinking of these concepts, especially this indigeneity, or that comes back as questions of autonomy, it is a double-edged sword, I would say. In one way, it shows us ways of being which have not been accommodated in this modern state formation. At the same time, though, it tends to privilege certain forms of experience and exclude others, and that's where sometimes the challenge is with some of these things of the first people, because then we can't read, I'm now answering this question of the COE. I think when we look at the question of the core, we have seen, you know, this commission on the core and also this recognition of their traditional authority. But within the Bill of Rights, they are still going to face a lot of challenges, you know, because of this bifurcation, you know, which I've mentioned. But I think the concept that we are also struggling with in this, while we are thinking of collective ways of being with the land, is this concept of citizenship, you know. We are truly struggling with the concept of citizenship because we are treating the concept of citizenship through the concept of nation state much more bureaucratically, you know. And we haven't explored ways of thinking of citizenship as ways of contributing to a society and then becoming part and parcel of that society because of one's contribution, you know. And then that goes just beyond being born there, but it creates an ethic of the collective. That is what another form of a radical form of citizenship that we need to imagine beyond just this, you know, bureaucratic through the nation state. So these are ideas that I'm also now starting to think with or even against, you know. But I have to say that this is, especially indigeneity, is truly a double-edged sword. And I see, I don't know if you want to go into the next Q&A, because I've already noted a question that was addressed to me.
Well, yeah, we have 3 more questions, and that's sort of one round that I think we have time for before we wrap up. So let me just, why don't I just go through the 3 questions and we'll hand back to the 2 remaining speakers. So one question here from Lydia. If we reduce life to the very basics, we would all need food and a safe place to live. If we tie ourselves to land, we also tie people to losing rights and ties quite randomly, depending how the climate change progresses. Is there a better way, using just the oversimplified principles of freedom of movement, to live somewhere that we can be safe and eat? And I have to say, this is a question that resonates with some work that I've been trying to do myself around how placemaking, you know, the very fact that people make their lives in a certain place is something that should come with a notion of rights, of belonging, that one shouldn't necessarily have to be burdened with demonstrating, you know, being a first inhabitant, so to speak, in order to have a certain set of rights. The next question is directly to Mbuso. Thank you for your informative presentation. Can you kindly speak on the evolving local governance in South Africa and customary land ownership rights when it comes to flow of capital, for example, land converted as a property of trust by the customary leaders? Reading South African scholars like Aninka Claessens, etc., and the 2017 parliamentary report on customary leadership, indigenous rights also seem to pose some problems with democratic rights. And another question from Shimreza to Noon. There was a paper from USAID in 2015 where the 2012 VFV land law is being negotiated for piecemeal engineering such that indigenous land rights are protected. For example, in one administrative region in Upland, Myanmar, acknowledge customary governance. Is there any success in customary rights recognition in other ethnic group areas? So why don't we, since Mbuso, since you were on a roll right now, I'll let you respond quickly and then we hand over to Noon.
Thanks. You know, there's a unit here at Wits University called Society Work and Politics Institute. They have been doing a lot of work, especially, you know, about these customary rights. We're looking at platinum mining areas, you know, where they show the dualities, you know. At one point, you would see things like, you know, where people sit and discuss collectively, and you think, okay, this is really progressive, it's grounded and rooted in their culture, you know. But when you realize deep, and especially the mining activists in these areas who are women, will tell you that those spaces are also gendered. They are not allowed to speak if they don't have a husband. If there is no husband, they even have to send their son who acts as their pros, you know. So those areas are also quite gendered. And this is what this discussion about, you know, the kingdom of rights, which the Comoros right of, versus, you know, the kingdom of the constitution, which is a difficult duality, because it shows us, in one way how beneficial these ways of discussing collective engagement are, but at the same time, it also shows us, especially in these areas where there's been injection of capital, how some of these chiefs are actually accelerating this process of dispossession, all in the name of a tribal authority, So even this tribal authority is not as progressive as we think it to be, but there are structures, and such structures also hold a potential. So that's why I think one has to read it in those dualities. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Mbuso. Over to you, Noon.
Thank you so much for the question. That yes, you mentioned that in one administrative region in upland Myanmar, it might be Nagaland, Naga area. Anyhow, so we activists, ethnic activists, indigenous activists, we have the connections. So although a paper in the USA in 2015, they mentioned that 2012 VFV law, the vacant, fair load and virgin lands management law, VFV law. Actually, I already represent in my presentation, these laws make indigenous land ownerless and became a legitimate tool for land grabbing. So because of these laws, most of our, ethnic people lost our land. So these laws favor to the, the land grabber who have the, close collaboration with the former authorities. So because we don't want to recognize to them as our government, so they are terrorists, they kill us. So that's why they are terrorists, they were not government. So that's why that anyhow, I like to share you that the one significant, our customary rights recognition is that Swelling Peace Park. So I will share you that in the, so I will share you in the chat box, webinar chat box, the Swelling Peace Park. Swelling Peace Park, you can find in the Google. This is the only, in Myanmar, this is the only one, indigenous people preserved area. So although even Swelling Peace Park, so current situation in civil war in Myanmar, so that's why that all of ethnic people, all of indigenous people are struggling in the civil war. So that's why although we knew about the laws and policy and for our land reform, but we couldn't focus currently because of all of the opposition to the junta are aside in the border area and the other countries. So I can say that we are the, we indigenous people, we protect our nature. We are the owner of our nature. So that's why that our land must be in our hands. We don't need, we don't need the, grabbing by the government or by the other, people who are from the urban area. Thank you.
All right, thanks very much. We are pretty much almost at time. There's about 5 or 6 minutes left. I'm trying to see if there are any last minute questions, which there are not. I think what remains to be done then is to thank our 3 panelists, Aashish in absentia because he's off teaching a class. So thank you, Noon, thank you, Mbuso, thank you, Aashish, for your presentations today and for the kind of dialogues that you've enabled us to have. It's been a great way for us and for us to inaugurate this webinar series, which there will be more sessions coming up from. and we'll keep you all posted on that. Thanks also to everyone who logged on for your presence and for your questions. And I hope everyone has a good day further across the multiple time zones that we're also negotiating here. So thanks a lot, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you so much.